found that women across the state of Kansas, across the United States, around the world have been without care. There are now just a small handful of physicians left here in the U.S., a few in the West, and one in the Midwest who are now providing care.
When you say that, it makes me feel like the campaign of terrorism, I consider it terrorism, I know that's a very loaded term, to shut down availability of this legally protected service in this country has been effective, that they haven't been able to do it legally, but they've done it practically. Do you feel like that's true?
I do. If you look at the number of physicians who are now offering abortion services across the United States, the number has dwindled. We see an aging population amongst abortion providers. Also, a couple of the physicians who are now practicing in another state, the anti-choice organization Operation Rescue has vowed to go and try to shut them down. So I think this is a real and true threat to physicians across the country.
What's the best way to fight back?
I think the best way to fight back is that we have to have boots on the ground in states, all the states across the U.S., states like Oklahoma, Mississippi, Nebraska, where legislators are working on a daily basis to roll back women's rights. We have to work to change the language that permeates our society, such as baby killer and murderer. Those are not acceptable terms, and that does not describe physicians who are providing reproductive health care services.
Julie Burkhart, head of the Trust Women PAC, worked with Dr. George Tiller for 8 years. I know it's a hard time to talk. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Thank you very much.
As we've just reported, Scott Roeder was sentenced to life in prison today for the murder of abortion doctor George Tiller. One way to put what Scott Roeder did into context is to talk about all of the other violence that has characterized the extreme anti-abortion movement that he was associated with. There's another thing about Scott Roeder that puts him and what he did into a slightly different but related context. Scott Roeder's arrest record emerged after he shot Dr. Tiller. It gives you some perspective on what else Scott Roeder was both interested in and involved in. In 1996, Scott Roeder was stopped by police for not having a license plate on his car. Instead of a license plate, he had a little tag affixed to his car that asserted that his car was sovereign private property. When police searched the car, they found bomb-making components in his trunk. Now, at the time, Scott Roeder's father told a local newspaper that Roeder had become involved with an anti-government group. That same year, in an interview conducted by fellow anti-abortion extremist Dave Leach, one of the people who testified on Roeder's behalf today, Scott Roeder, in this interview with Dave Leach, was introduced as a member of the Montana Free Men, an anti-government extremist group associated with the militia movement. In that interview 14 years ago, Scott Roeder talked about things like the difference he saw between God's law and man's law.
I think it comes down to our God-given rights, and one of those is the God-given right to travel. And what the state has done is turned that into a privilege to drive. And how they do that is through our driver's license, when we sign for a driver's license.
So yes, you can see Scott Roeder as an anti-abortion extremist. You can also identify anti-abortion extremism as one branch of the broader movement of violent, militant, anti-government extremism in this country. We associate that movement with the early and mid-90s, which is when that tape of Scott Roeder that you just saw was filmed. But just in the last 18 months, since President Obama took office, a white supremacist shot and killed a security guard in an attack on the Holocaust Museum in Washington. An anti-tax extremist flew a plane into a building in Texas that housed an IRS office. He killed an IRS worker. 9 suspected militia members arrested for allegedly plotting an attack on police officers as part of a war they wanted to wage against the United States government. A Tennessee white supremacist convicted of plotting to kill President Obama near the end of the presidential campaign in 2008. And of course, there's Scott Roeder killing Dr. George Tiller. And of course, there's the wave of threats and property damage against members of Congress after the health reform bill passed. Is it helpful to find the connections between these disparate acts, to understand what American extremism is now? Or are all these individual crazy people with no connection to politics, no connection to each other, no connection to a broader movement or to the broader country at large? What's the best way to understand this, and is this stuff going to stop? Joining us now is Eugene Robinson, Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist and an associate editor for The Washington Post. He's also an MSNBC political analyst. Gene, thanks very much for being here.
Great to be here, Rachel, and happy April Fool's Day.
You can just say happy Thursday if you want. That works. Appreciate it. The questions that I asked there at the end of my intro are sort of the questions that I have for you. I mean, is it useful to find connections between these admittedly disparate acts? Does that help us understand extremism, help try to stop it?
Yes, these are, number one, yes, these are all individual crazy people, but number two, they are operating in a context. And if you look at what the groups like the Southern Poverty Law Center and the Anti-Defamation League, and indeed the Justice Department and the Department of Homeland Security are saying, we are seeing an increase now, a kind of a resurgence of this far-right, militant, militia-style anti-government activity. It's bubbling out there, and it seems like the temperature has been turned up.
In terms of that environment, what creates that environment? Is it literally just the ambient politics in the country, or are people who are in positions of authority stoking this, either knowingly or unknowingly, in a way that's really directly affecting how encouraged these people are toward extremist acts?
I think both. I think it's irresponsible, I believe, for a national political figure to put on her Facebook page, Republicans don't retreat, reload, and then mark the various congressional districts with crosshairs of a rifle scope, as Sarah Palin did. It was irresponsible, in my view, of Republican members of Congress to come out on the balcony of the Capitol the weekend that health care was being passed and encourage and kind of whip up the Tea Party crowd that was outside in the way that they did. Of course, it's fine for them to be against health care reform. That's the way our democracy works. Some people are for it, some people are against it. But the stuff at the margins, at the fringe, on the far right, that is where the threat of political violence in our society comes from now. It wasn't always like this. Back in the 1970s, it was all coming from the left, and you had the Weather Underground. The first big story I covered was the trial of Patricia Hearst, who had been kidnapped and then co-opted by the Symbionese Liberation Army. They were just as incoherent and apocalyptic as the Hatari militia. But that was then, and this is now, and it is not responsible or true, I think, to say, oh, well, there are crazies on both sides, and just kind of dust it off. In fact, the threat of that sort of violence comes almost exclusively right now from the right, from the far right.
One of the issues, and maybe this is a semantic issue, but it's one that I think it matters, and that is, Dr. Tiller's attorney today called his murder domestic terrorism. I, in my last segment, described it as something that I believe is terrorism. Do you think that acts of violence like this, that are for a political purpose, the way this was, should be called domestic terrorism? Does it matter? Is that an important distinction? Does that just raise the temperature without shedding any more light on things?
Well, I do think it's domestic terrorism. I think by any sort of definition, it is not only political in nature. It was designed to frighten and intimidate others from performing legally protected medical procedures. I think sure it was terrorism in my book. And now I am not sure that ultimately, if you don't want to call it terrorism, that's fine. Just keep an eye on these people. That's what I ask, and what I think the FBI, frankly, has been doing a pretty good job of, at least in terms of the militias. You saw that the Hatari people got rolled up just as they were planning some sort of activity in April. What concerns me is not just the militia that we know about, but the people who are out there that we don't know about, that authorities don't know about. And again, as the temperature gets turned up against on all the rhetoric, the invective, the anger, one worries about the effect it's having on these people who are kind of out there in the woods by themselves or by twos and threes and haven't really come on the radar scope of authorities yet.
Absolutely. Smart point. Eugene Robinson, Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist, associate editor for The Washington Post. It's always great to have you on the show, Gene. Thank you.
Great to be here, Rachel.